good.
So good.
So good.
So good. Today's going to be the first in a series of 6, our deep dive into summer bourbon. We're dubbing it the Summer of Bourbon, but this is a project that Luke and I have been talking about for quite some time. Bourbon is where our bar base is, so why not take a deep dive into the expansive history and the reasons why we bourbon. Today we're going to cover the history of bourbon and then more into how bourbon became what it is and then the basics behind bourbon. Each week we're going to expand upon what we're doing today. We've invited different people from different distribution chains to come in and to talk about their products and to bring those in and talk about those with us. The program, of course, and I've got the schedule on Schedulefly. It's also hanging in the back for everybody with the schedule behind things. But we're going to do 2 Mondays, then we're going to take a break for a Monday. I'm in Kentucky for extra bourbon knowledge, learning, and certification, and visiting a whole bunch of places there. And then we finish the last 4 weeks. To pair with that, we've got a contest running that starts today and runs through September 22nd, and we'll touch more on that at the end of the class. Love It has, this is the traditional old-style bourbon cocktail. This is a simple cocktail. This is Buffalo Trace and ginger ale, coming around for everybody, but basic simple cocktail. And then from here, you can make it into a Kentucky Mule with lime juice and have fun there. This is something that I use as a go-to that I find super refreshing and fun. So.
I also messed up the ratios. Just Buffalo Trace.
Alright, so today we're going to talk about the history of bourbon, what is bourbon, and then market trends and why we're choosing to spend 6 weeks talking about bourbon. And we're going to start with the history of things. I could teach 6 weeks on just the history of bourbon, and that would probably put everyone to sleep. I've taken what I found to be some of the most interesting components and linked them all together. There is so much reading, there are videos, History Channel has done documentation on the history of bourbon, so I certainly encourage you to look more into this. And we'll start with how Kentucky came to be. But we're going back to 1776, the Virginia General Assembly decided that the area past the Appalachian Mountains was to be described as Kentucky County. Fast forward a couple years later, Kentucky County was split into 3 different smaller counties. These names you should all be familiar with from American history: Jefferson County, Lincoln County, and Fayette County. Fayette County was named after Lafayette, who helped the Americans tremendously during the American Revolution. After that, Fayette County was split into what is now considered Bourbon County, and it was named after the French House of Bourbon, who also provided tremendous amounts of aid to the Americans during the American Revolution. That happened in between all of those. I don't have the years committed. 1785, Kentucky became the 15th state. It is the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And then we jump to 1794. We have what now? So the Whiskey Rebellion, the whiskey tax, was put in place by Alexander Hamilton, who decided that we needed to cover the costs that a lot of states ensued during the American Revolution, so they taxed liquors that went in park. It became known as the Whiskey Rebellion and was fought with resistance from the very beginning. This was presented to George Washington. He went around and told people why he himself was against this. Everybody that he talked to said, hey, this is a great idea and we should put a tax on whiskey. The tax then was 6 cents a gallon for large producers, and small producers paid 9 cents a gallon. When we convert that into today's dollars, those taxes were $1.40 per gallon and $2.10 per gallon. People who were, that's a lot. Like when you think about it, like how much are you charging for it? You take out all the costs behind it. This is a huge cost to people producing whiskey. They fought it, they wouldn't pay it, there were riots in the streets, and that's what this rendering is. This guy was a tax collector, and this happened in Pennsylvania where he went to collect taxes. The people, the men, dressed as women, attacked him in the streets, stripped him naked, tarred and feathered him, stole his horse, and left him in the woods. The guy that was there to collect tax on people producing whiskey.
Wait, is that real?
That's real. This is all. It's amazing.
Actual picture taken.
So, tarred and feathering happened, and it happened really not that long ago when you think about it. This was not that long ago. The militia set up by the people were set to rebel and set to attack. This was the only force that a sitting president led into battle, and this was George Washington who led the forces into battle on this. Overall, the whiskey tax, the Whiskey Rebellion, was seen as a complete disaster, and it was repealed in 1802. So, when we talk about bourbon, quick quiz for everybody. Who made bourbon first? And there are three schools of thought behind this. The first one being in the 1800s, Baptist minister Elijah Craig taking old barrels and barrels that were used for fish and pickles and needed something to store his bourbon in, so he charred them first to get rid of the smell behind it, and then he stored his bourbon in. That's your first choice. Or was it a poor farmer who had a fire and essentially had to use those barrels because there was no money to use anything else, and he put those charred barrels and sent them down the river to New Orleans? Or was it a grocer in Lexington who was seeing trends out of France and seeing that cognac barrels were slightly toasted? So who made bourbon first?
See.
Okay, hands up, Elijah Craig. Hands up, your poor farmer. And hands up, the Lexington grocer. And what about everybody else?
All of it doesn't matter. Everyone together.
I was
No one
All
knows.
good stories.
It doesn't matter. The history is lost. Nobody really knows who did it first. All that matters is the bourbon found a way, and it is what it is. What is worth noting that in the 18th century, almost all farmers produced some kind of whiskey. The pattern was we were growing grain. At the end of the season, we had extra and had to do something with it. If we left it in its natural state, it would rot, the rats would eat it, it would be a complete waste. So the first step was to make beer. If beer is perishable and it needs to be chilled, and it didn't have a long shelf life. The next step after that became whiskey. Whiskey is able to be stored easily in barrels, in clay pots, and any kind of thing that you could store it in. And oftentimes, whiskeys were more valuable as liquid than they were the total of their ingredients that went into them, so you had value behind them as well. They were also really easy to trade in easy quantities. I will give you a thing of this for a thing of whiskey. 1821, the first trace of the word bourbon was used, and it was in Kentucky's Western Citizen, and it was an ad from a company named Stout and Adams, and they were selling bourbon by the barrel. In 1826, the first written association of bourbon with charred barrels was coming from a Lexington grocer at that point. He has requested burnt barrels, and there's written documentation of that happening in 1826. So 1830, this is when branding and brand names came into place. So when people were producing, they were taking branding irons that you would brand cattle with and branding their names into the barrel heads. This is where we get the term brand names, because they were branded on the barrels. This let people know what they were drinking and being able to recognize what they liked in things, so they knew they could go back to the same producer every time and get the same product every time. Does that make sense? I think that's cool. Putting this together, I'm like, that's where that came from. Things that we use and use the terms every day. You're like, oh, brand names are everywhere. That's where that came from. In the 1850s, we did a lot of development into the science behind whiskey. The process had become a scientific process, and this is oftentimes thanks to Dr. James Crow of Old Crow. You'll find Old Crow on the bottom shelf at the liquor store. But he was from Scotland, immigrated to the United States, ended up in Kentucky, and studied science and medicine. So we went to work in the U.S. at a distillery and studied the process of understanding bourbon, why things worked the way that they did, and how to improve the flavor by bringing in the process. This defined what we know bourbon as today. In the 1870s, this is a label that we recognize, George Gavin Brown recognized that bottling bourbon created legitimacy, safety, it prevented tampering, and it let the customer know that they were buying what was actually in the bottle. We don't think about it today, but in the 1800s, you could buy something and it would be completely fake, and you would have no idea what you were buying because people were watering down the product or cutting it or putting something else in it to reduce the cost so they had more profit. We don't think that that happens because we buy bottles, they're sealed, we know what's in them. That didn't happen then. This was the first step to doing so. This was the first bourbon to be sold exclusively by the bottle. Old Forester is still something that's produced today. 1886, this is something that Lovett will enjoy. This is when bartenders really started playing with and making fun things out of cocktails. And this is where we see the first Old Fashioned. This was done at the Pendennis Club in Louisville, which is still around and still operating. It is a gentleman's style club right in downtown Louisville. But they were playing with different ingredients to jazz up their cocktails and to make them more exciting and a little more interesting along the way. 1897, we see the Bottled and Bond Act. Bottled and Bond is still something that we can have today. I don't think we have anything that's bottled and bond, but what this act did was this was the first time the U.S. government stepped in and said, hey, we're going to regulate a product, and it was whiskey. Then it was whiskey. It became what's called bourbon. Bourbon guarantees that the product is made at one distiller, so the person who made it is the person who's turning around and selling it, that it was made in one season, so everything in the same barrel is the same age, and that it's distilled at exactly 100 proof along the way. It's put into bottles with the name, when it was barreled, when it was barreled, the barrel number behind it, and it was sealed with a certificate from the government. You knew exactly what you were buying, and it was guaranteed. Bottled and bond products have to be stored in a government mandated warehouse for 4 years before they can even go on to the market. Who's this guy?
William Howard Taft.
That's President Taft. 1909.
Nice dash.
He's a big guy. He got stuck in the bathtub. Yes. President Taft signed the Taft decision, and the Taft decision, what we're reading now, 100 plus years later, is what defined bourbon as it is. The decision, the Taft decision, defined what could be called straight whiskey, blended whiskey, and imitation whiskey. The rules have changed slightly since this was written. It was changed in 1938 to include new barrels, and it was changed in 1964 to establish that it was made in the United States. But this was the main document that helped define what bourbon is. So 1920, 1933, what's happening in this country then?
No alcohol.
Prohibition. It's not a fun time. If you look at most of the history that happens between 1920 and 1933, there's a lot of really sad stuff and really not good stuff that happened between them. Prohibition. Let me get so big. Prohibition is the national constitutional ban on the production, importation, transportation, and sale of alcohol for 13 years. This devastated the economy. lots of distilleries closed. They allowed 6 distilleries at the time to remain open and sell under medicinal use titles, but you couldn't produce, you could only sell what you already had. So when your stock was depleted, that was it. It was over. American Medicinal Spirits, which became National Distilleries, was one of them. Shenley Distilleries, James Thompson and Brother, that became Glenmore down the road. Frankfurt Distilleries, Brown Forman and P.H. Schnitzel, Stitzel Distillery, which down the road became the Pappy brand. But that was it. Those were the only people that could sell for 13 years. After this was repealed in 1933, you can distill again, you can produce again, and then World War II happened. So by the time your stocks were where they needed to be to produce, the market just went down again. So in the 60s, this is when we have bourbon being defined as a distinctive product of the United States. So further defining what the rules are and what defines bourbon. At this time, people in the 60s and the 70s rejected really everything that their parents did, and anything that their parents did, they weren't going to have a part of it. So this is when we see rise of tequilas and vodkas and beer and wine. Jim Beam decided that would be a great idea to hire Sean Connery for an ad campaign with a reference to James Bond. James Bond drank vodka and Sean Connery is Scottish. So they were doing what they could to help a market that just wasn't growing in their favor. In the 80s, they had more challenges with the market because we saw the growth and the development of MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Sober living became trendy. Celebrities were pushing sober lifestyle. There was a recession in the 80s. Extra money to spend on drinking just really wasn't there. Places like Ancient Age, which was the first to do a single barrel production, followed the Scotch companies that were making single barrel and single batch production in Scotland and tried to do it in the United States. And that pretty much brings us up to modern trends, which we're going to jump back into after we talk about what is bourbon and the regulations behind it and how it comes to be. But any questions so far?
You said Ancient Age was the first single barrel whiskey?
In the US, yeah. And then they did that in 1984. So what is bourbon?
Corn.
Okay, elaborate.
It's at least 51%.
51% corn. What else? That's one of them.
Barley.
Maybe, but not always. It can be. Cereal grains compose the other 49%. From there, they can be any combination of that. But 51% corn is one of them. What else? Made in America.
Aged in sharp oak barrels.
White oak, but yes.
At least Asia.
In the bottle, yes. Cool. Bourbon is defined as America's only native spirit, and this was established in Congress in 1964. It is made with a minimum of 51% corn, aged in charred new oak barrels, stored at no more than 125 proof, and barreled at no less than 80 proof. Really cool way to remember that. The ABCs of bourbon. I love this. I'm super excited about this. A, you're American made. You're made in the United States. A lot of misconception is that bourbon has to be made in Kentucky, while a large majority of it is. By our list, bourbon can be made in the United States. We have bourbons from all over the country represented on our list. B is your barrel. Brand new, charred, white oak barrels. And from those barrels, you get flavors of caramel and vanilla. And we're going to go into the barrels deeper in just a bit. C is your corn. You get sweetness from the corn, and bourbon, by definition, has to be at least 51% corn. The corn you use is up to distilleries. We're going to talk about corn in a minute. Your distillation proof, the proof that the bourbon has to be coming off the still, is no more than 160 proof. To put this in perspective, a lot of the bourbons on the shelf are distilled at higher than 160 proof. The bourbon market feels that this takes away from the flavor and the characteristics of the bourbon, so they keep it at no more than 160 proof to keep the flavor. Your entry proof is what it goes into the barrel at, so taking that 160 and adding water to bring it down to 125 or less going into the barrel. And then your fill proof is what goes into the bottle, and your bottle is at 80 proof or above, and that's with the addition of water also. And genuine. The only things that can go into bourbon are corn, cereal grains, and water. When you add anything else, it goes right back to being whiskey. We have time here?
Does it have to be American?
I'm not able to find a definitive answer for that, but I will find out at the bridge. Some places say American oak, some places don't.
The law itself did not say American, but I keep asking that as well because it's one of those that like, well, if it's an American product, it's assumed, but I can't find it written anywhere that just says American.
I told you somebody would ask that.
Somebody would ask.
Thanks for being there.
I have a tour set up at the Brown Forman Cooperage, which produces 600,000 barrels a year. Next week. So I'll find out next week and I'll let you know. So what's on the label? There's a lot that's on the label that can tell us about what's in the bottle. We'll start with Kentucky bourbon. Kentucky bourbon is aged in the state of Kentucky for at least 1 year. A straight bourbon is aged for a minimum of 2 years. Single barrel doesn't have a definition. It's implied that it's from a single barrel, but it doesn't have to be.
Old plans.
It's better business than
How much for the straight bourbon?
The straight bourbon is minimum of 2 years. 1 year in Kentucky.
A little bit of all the single barrels.
And singles, they can just.
So how do they ensure integrity of what they're saying, if it's single, or is it just, they can put it on there if they want?
They can put it on there if they want. It's implied that it's from one barrel, but that's,
Is there any aging standards to that?
Probably like 51%. Doesn't have to be like.
it doesn't, there is no definition
But it's
behind
not
what's
considered,
in
but
the
it's not
bottle.
considered, like, for lack of a better term, like throwaway compared to the rest that are aged specifically under certain guidelines.
So in looking at and reading about all of these distillers, if product isn't to their standards, they don't produce it. It doesn't go into a bottle.
Okay, so
A
there's
high level, mid
default to a
level,
single
low
barrel.
level, if it's not good, it's not bottled. Barrel strength is the strength that it comes out of the barrel, and no water is added after it's aged in the barrel.
Wait, can you repeat that?
Yeah, barrel strength is coming, it goes from the still into the barrel. There's water added at that process, but there's no extra water added to cut it after it goes from the barrel into the bottle.
So that's basically the filter.
That would be the fill proof. Most times there's water added going from the barrel.
It's close, but there would be evaporation based on the breathing of the barrels. So some of the alcohol could escape it. So you could have put it in at 124 and it came out at 116. You aged it longer and it came out at 111. So there is the evaporation factor, so it's not the correlation.
Alright. Small batch also doesn't have a definition. Some distilleries define what their small batch is, but they don't have to. So again, you can say small batch for us is a blending of 2 barrels, and small batch for someone else is a blending of 50 barrels. It just depends on where you are. Some places release that information, some places don't. And bottled and bond that we already touched on, made in 1 season at 1 distillery and aged for 4 years at exactly 100 proof. Yeah, not that I'm moving out of the screen, you can see that it's not on there. Made in 1 season by 1 distillery at 100 proof 4 years in a government bonded warehouse.
Any examples of that in this building? No, right?
I don't think we have anything that's bottled and bonded.
It's not on the menu.
It's not.
We just found it.
Interesting.
Spirits.
Me and Todd.
Todd, what is it?
We're gonna bottle our own forgery. That bar has some crazy stuff going on in there.
One distillery in one season
One season.
at 100 proof. So 111
Yeah.
at 100 proof.
Government owned, right?
Government not owned, but government bonded warehouse.
And when you say 100 proof,
50% alcohol by volume.
okay, but is that?
So proof comes from having to prove that the alcohol content you say is actually what it was. So if you were to light it on fire, we're gonna go to fire in a couple steps. Water and alcohol boil at different temperatures. So if you boil it, half the water goes away. It's 50% alcohol by volume, giving you 100 proof.
And that's what it is coming out of the barrel to the bottom,
Going into the bottle.
going into the bottom.
Bottled at 100 proof. So how is bourbon made? Carefully. So back. Thanks, Josh.
I feel like his mind was turning and he had like 16 answers and he said carefully, he's like, yeah, it's a good one. That's a good one.
That works. So your mash bill, your recipe, the ingredients that go into it, 51% being corn, and then the rest of it are cereal grains. So malted barley, rye, and wheat are your most common things. I went to a Japanese whiskey tasting the other day, and there are whiskeys being made in the United States with rice. Apparently rice is now considered a cereal grain. I hadn't heard about that. I hadn't seen it. Evan Williams, bottled and bond. Nice.
Be on your list.
That's 3 grand.
Wow.
That showed up magically in the
What's the
inventory.
price point on it? I'm just curious.
I gotta find out.
Find what we paid for it.
Right.
So most of the time, distilleries are using number 2 corn. And number 2 corn is just the variety of corn that it is. There's a whole legal definition of what number 2 corn is. It's just the species of corn. It's grown in mass quantities. But corn's adding sweetness to the bourbon. We are seeing trends that smaller distilleries are using heirloom corn. Those are going to be made in smaller distilleries that can use smaller quantities of corn. A big distillery like Buffalo Trace wouldn't be able to carry the demand for blue corn, red corn, white corns of heirloom varieties, but we are seeing, there was a blue corn, Balcones out of Virginia.
Texas, they're using like 6 different strains of corn that grow across the border. It's
Okay.
an anti-wall bourbon one. I liked it. It was
It was
good.
good.
Yeah.
After that, rye, just like rye bread and like wheat bread, you're going to get different characteristics from both of those. Rye
Take a swig,
adds a
everybody.
dryness and a spice to the bourbon. And then wheated, just like wheat bread, adds that slightly nutty characteristics. From here, you can do a mainly wheated bourbon, which would be something like what Weller is producing. The Pappies are wheated bourbons. They are mainly wheat on this side. Things that are rye-heavy bourbons are going to be spicier in flavor and consistency. Just like you would get a loaf of wheat bread at the grocery store and a loaf of rye bread at the grocery store. They bring the same characteristics. What did you have any?
Hold on.
Oh, I thought you had something.
I'm sorry, what was the characteristic of barley to that?
Barley, I have to go. Barley provides the enzymes to convert simple sugars into starch and to start the fermentation process.
So not really a flavor agent.
It adds the enzyme. It's usually 5 to 10%. And water. Kentucky sits in the sweet spot. It has this amazing climate that's really hot in the summers and really cold in the winters, and it sits on a limestone aquifer that provides water. 60% of bourbon is water, so we're wanting to pull the best water in the country for it. What this limestone does to the water is it essentially makes it hard water and removes all of the iron elements to it. Iron is bad for wine, iron is bad for bourbon, iron is just really something that we don't want in water. We have limestone rich water here, and it's probably some of the best water in the country. They have the same style of water in Kentucky. This water, which is made up of calcium and magnesium carbonates, and that's what's really good for the bourbon within the water. Those calcium and magnesium carbonates that are added help the yeast thrive in fermentation and in the process. So we touched on the mash bill earlier. The mash bill is the recipe, the ingredients of corn and other cereal grains to it. There's a really cool chart on modernthirst.com that's gone through the bourbons that have their mash bill disclosed of what bourbons contain what mash bill. So if you're more of a wheated bourbon or a rye bourbon, you can find out exactly what the percentages that go into each of those. That is modernthirst.com. I did not link it on the website, but I will put a link to it on the website after class today. So the cooking process, once the mash bill is selected and mixed with water and cooked, this breaks down the grains and gelatinizes the starches. After the starch is gelatinized, the enzymes in the malted barley break down the starch molecules in the mash bill into fermented sugars. This is the same process that goes into making beer. And this can be done in a short amount of time, usually about an hour for the entire cooking process. After everything's cooked, it's cooled down to 70 degrees Fahrenheit and moved into fermentation tanks. Fermentation tanks shown here are older open wood fermentation tanks. They can be anything, there's no regulation on what your fermentation tanks can be. They can be stainless steel, they can be covered, they can be open, they can be cypress, really anything from here. I found it really cool. Buffalo Trace has 12 fermentation tanks at 92,000 gallons each. And then my brain goes into, what was that whiskey tax again? Like,
Hold on.
There's the largest.
92,000 gallons at $2 each is $200,000 to make it. We're doing this on a much larger scale than they were in the 1800s, but that's where my brain goes, how much? How much would that have cost?
I shoot my tax budget.
Right? You talk about that and leave them hanging in the streets too, right? There is a portion of the mash from last batch added to this batch in fermentation to help kickstart the fermentation process.
Like a mother does.
Exactly like a mother dough. So this is, this smells and tastes like sourdough bread at this point. This is usually a 3-day process. From here, this goes into distillation, and we've all talked about distillation before the distillation process, because water boils at 212 degrees and alcohol boils at 173 degrees. When you use the difference in temperature, your vapors from your alcohol heat, cook, turn into vapor, and rise. And then you bring them back down, you put them through cold water and turn those vapors back into liquids. This is a separation of water and mash into alcohol. For bourbon, this is usually done twice, removing impurities, keeping the corns out, keeping the grains out, keeping the water out. In vodka, this is done up to, 9 times in some vodkas that are 9 times distilled, and that just removes more and more and more from the product. Bourbon wants to keep their flavor. Vodka wants to remove their flavor, so that's what they're doing in each of these. What comes out at this point is a clear liquid, and this is either called White Dog or White Lightning. There's some places bottle this directly off the still. It is still considered whiskey at this point, but I'm seeing if we can get some White Dog try so we can see the before and the after product.
Just I know you mentioned the vodka. How many times do you have to distill something or remove the gluten from it?
I'm sorry, ask me
How many
again.
times do you have to distill something or remove the gluten from it?
I don't.
I thought all products after distillation was considered gluten-free.
Yeah, as I've read it, that
So
gluten,
using bourbon
gluten,
with-
sugar, the
Yeah.
protein itself does not survive a single distillation, but it does survive fermentation. So I always looked at it as we're screwed on soy sauce, but Tito Beverage made $1 billion off of marketing.
Right.
Yeah. So my understanding is that
So one time.
all
Everything's gluten.
one time,
If it's distilled,
all
it's gluten-free.
if it's gone
Yes.
through distillation, beer is not. This is essentially beer going in, distilled. It's gluten free. Vodka does it over and over and over and over again, taking away all of the flavoring behind it.
Tito's just paid to have this
Oh, no, I
certificate to
know
be
that.
officially recognized as gluten free.
Also, it's vegan.
And true.
And if you love dollars.
Grey Goose is just as gluten free as Tito's.
Yeah, vodka, bourbon, scotch, all gluten free.
What's
They've
moonshine?
all gone through distillation.
What the radiator was just.
I was just thinking, the base of it's wheat
Really?
barley. I don't know how you could distill that out of it just one time. That's what I was thinking.
No, it's
you
because
could give someone with
gluten's-
celiac disease a shot of Buffalo Trace and they're gonna be fine.
Yes,
No?
yes, absolutely. Gluten is just, it's a
Who's
molecule.
ready to risk them?
Yeah, that's what I heard. Come here, Sally Rosen.
Gluten is just a molecule that breaks down.
Aren't we all? Alright, barrels.
All right, barrels. What are the barrel requirements for it to be bourbon?
White oak.
White oak charred.
New.
And new?
New white oak charred barrels. Most barrels are 53 gallons. There are no screws, no nails, no anything to keep them held together. Just the bindings that go around the barrels that keep them held together. I'm going to put this down because I need 2 hands. The charring acts as a filter. And when we go into Kentucky and we look at the summers and the winters in Kentucky, when things, in the summertime, things expand, the barrels expand, liquid goes through the barrels, and in the winter it's cold, everything contracts. So for every year that you have bourbon sitting in a barrel, think of it as taking one big breath in and one big breath out. If you don't have that climate change, Scotland, Ireland, you don't take big breaths, you take little short breaths because it's the same all year long. So the more age you have, the more movement you have through the barrels. When you break the barrels apart, and I'll bring barrel pieces back, but you can see how far the liquid went into the oak and retreated from the oak between each breath that it took, for lack of better terms. You have a whole bunch of different charring types, and that's how long the fire spends in the barrel. Level 1 of char is 15 seconds, all the way to level 4 of char, which spends 55 seconds on fire. Your level 3 and your level 4 are your most common. Some places go up to a level 7 on the char level, which I think is wild. But at level 4, it gets a texture to it that is called alligator skin, because that's exactly what it looks like on the char levels.
Is it true that Angel's Envy is technically not considered bourbon because it wasn't aged in oak barrels, it was aged in some sort of like port wine?
So once you take it out of a bourbon barrel and you put it in a sherry or a rye or a wine cask, it's not bourbon anymore. You can label it as bourbon aged in sherry casks, but it's technically whiskey. Just like the Rosies, that may very well have been bourbon to start, but you added apples and cinnamon to make it apple pie, and it became whiskey again. So as soon as you deviate from the set of rules, you're back to being whiskey. Bourbon is whiskey. Whiskey is not bourbon. Does that make sense?
We worked around it by using the word finished. So it's a finished bourbon. So it did come out as the bourbon, and then as the extra seasoning, it was the bourbon. They were the first one to do that, so that was their compromise.
And that's why we have it both under bourbon and whiskey or rye, Angel's Envy.
No, it's
Well,
two
rye is
different
rye.
No, rye's right.
It's 2 different ones.
We have Angel's Envy Rye and Angel's
Well,
Envy
there's
Bourbon.
Angel's Envy Bourbon and there's Angel's Envy Rye.
Okay, okay.
And the rye's not
The
part
bourbon is in a
It's a rum cask.
The bourbon is bourbon. It starts off, and then when it's finished, once they put it into the port cask, they don't have a technical definition, but figure it's roughly like 4 years and 18 months. They do it by taste, so they don't lock in the amount of time that they claim, which again is more marketing, so we can have this discussion. But to say finished, they had a bourbon at some point, but when they put that bourbon into the port cask, they're like, you cannot call it bourbon anymore. So their fight back and forth was to call it finished bourbon. It's when they want to do something. Like Ciroc wines call it vodka when it should be brandy, and they spent all that money to get it reclassified as vodka, even though it's making grapes. Same concept.
And is it on the after the char process? Do they do anything else to the barrel before they put the?
Do they do anything else to the barrel?
Yeah.
Not to my knowledge. It goes from being, it rests, but I don't think there's anything that's done to the barrel after it's been charred.
I just asked if we got these little barrels at the house for my
Finishing
bar.
the rye and then putting
And he
in
said
the
that I
barrels
needed to
for
do some either distilled water or something like that.
You might need
to get it ready
You might need
before.
to seal it or to do something to it so it's in your home, so it's not a barrel that's been burned and then bourbon. And then moving forward, I'll ask at the cooperage.
Just a question because I would think that the burning process would dry that wood inside, right? And
Oak is pretty resilient. Oak holds up to it very well. It's a watertight seal. Just because it's watertight doesn't mean that it's airtight. So it moves and it expands and contracts. After it's a bourbon barrel, you see bourbon barrels sold to wine aged in bourbon barrels, or rums aged in bourbon barrels. There are more bourbon barrels in Kentucky than there are humans in Kentucky. And a place like the Brown-Forman Cooperage producing 600,000 barrels a year, there is really no place for them to go. The bourbon industry doesn't have any use for the barrels once they've been used. Except
the
to put
breweries.
flowers in them. They send them to beer breweries. They sell them. It's just like wine. It costs so much to make. Use it once or twice, and then you have to pay someone to take it off your property because it's not good. And that's when other industries have said, "Hey, we'll take your bourbon barrels and we'll store something else so that we can use them."
How do they, like, what's the mining mechanism that they use to?
A torch. Depends on which ones. There's pictures of them on their sides, with like the front, the back, the head, and the tail open, and they just shoot fire into them. There are pictures of them standing up tall that the fire comes down from. Each cooperage is going to be different in how they run them.
So Schultz, your question about the finished rye?
Yeah.
Yes, it's the same concept, that it started aged a certain way and then they finished in their own casks, but you're not trying to dodge any rules. There's nothing that you have to dodge about what makes a rye a rye. So it's done the same way, they use the same wording, but they're not trying to dance around a rule.
The rules of bourbon are pretty strict.
So then in general, if you're getting 15-year or 20-year age pot pack, then it is one barrel the whole time. The whole time.
They may blend it to keep consistency between it, but it's coming from the same.
And then now with that
selection.
story of the guy with the larceny who was tipping in, and that's how they knew which ones were the good ones. They were reusing the good barrels, weren't they? So wouldn't that make it not bourbon anymore?
No, they were tasting from each barrel. The bourbon masters, the master distillers, taste from the barrels to know when it's time to pull from them, whether to
Yeah.
pull it now, whether to leave it for another year. It's not you open it and you see if it's good or not. Sometimes they let them sit for too long, and it's like, well, we should pull this from years ago.
What was the story behind Larceny?
Larceny was the guy that they hired to keep track and to secure the bourbon, would go in and taste from each one, and then he would find one that he likes, and that would be the lightest barrel out of all of them, and that was like their marker for the good stuff, because that was the light.
So it has a key on the bottom, like the label, because it's the key of the guy who's in charge of it.
So he named your bourbon after somebody who stole from you for years and years.
Exactly.
is what you did.
Great job.
Alright, so aging of bourbon happens in rick houses. There's been a lot of news about the rick houses catching on fire in Kentucky with super hot summers and storms and lightning. These fires go fast and hot and they're out of control. But where you store your bourbon is an indicator of how your bourbon ages. So as you get higher in the rick house, your climate actually gets warmer and less humid at the top. So your premium locations in the rick house are at the top, and on the bottom you have more humidity in cooler climates. These dictate how your barrels expand and contract on a minor standpoint, but your premium locations are top. If my memory serves me correct, and correct me if I'm wrong, Pappy is stored in the northwest corner of the rick house. Weller is stored directly underneath it. So you're just moving a couple layers in storing. So after it's aged, you go to vatting or what's called blending. Some bourbons are blended to keep consistency. Some come directly out of the barrels as they are into single barrel selections. Again, no definition on what makes a single barrel or a small batch. Most bourbons get some kind of blending so the product is the same across the board, so that every bottle of Buffalo Trace or Evan Williams that you get is the same going across the board. Fun tidbit, when I was looking through all of this, whiskey blended in the United States is only required to contain 20% of whiskey. The other 80% is essentially vodka. Like, that's interesting. Yeah, blended whiskey, according to government regulations, is only has to be 20% whiskey. The other 80% can be vodka, essentially. That's what moonshine is. The whole market for like being in Tennessee and seeing moonshine distilleries, it's vodka. It's flavored vodka that they're marketing as whiskey because they can. Moonshine is a catch-all for anything that doesn't fit in any other category. I'm like, you guys think all these people are drinking moonshine? They're drinking flavored vodka.
Almost any time you're in a regular bar, if you look at their well boozes, most of them, like Montezuma for instance, is not tequila. It's grain alcohol flavored like tequila.
Wow.
A lot of those well ones, like those whiskeys, it says grain alcohol flavored like whiskey. And if you look on the bottle, it actually says.
No
No,
concern.
not here. Sorry. I said it's shitty bar, but it's a good one.
Alright, after you've gone through blending, you can go into filtering. Some places filter, some places don't filter. It's a completely optional option that's held by the distiller. Filtering removes any leftover particles, any corn that may have slipped through distillation, any barrel pieces that may have happened during aging. It creates a very polished look. That's the actual way to do it, is in a filter. You can also chill filter, which I thought was really, really cool. You reduce the temperature between 4 to 14 degrees Fahrenheit, and it causes a scientific reaction that pulls the fatty acid chains together, and you can filter them out when the molecules are held together. It doesn't help, these acids don't help, they don't hurt the bourbon, they're just there, but what it can do is if bourbon gets cold, in colder climates, it can create a cloudy bourbon, which some people may think of as a defective product. It's not, that's just the way that it is. So either it went through chill filtration or it did not. What makes Tennessee whiskey different than bourbon is Tennessee whiskey starts as bourbon, and how it becomes Tennessee whiskey is it's made in Tennessee, and if you've met anybody from Tennessee, they're super proud that they're from Tennessee. Whiskey is the same way, and it goes through a maple charcoal filter to remove any of those impurities. Good? Proofing is the action of adding water to bring that bottling down to 80 proof or proof of 80 or above, and that's adding natural water back. You can add a little water, you can add however much water the distiller and the distiller master thinks is appropriate for the bourbon itself to keep it consistent with its brand. Then it's rested, and it's rested to allow integration for the water to blend itself properly and balanced with the bourbon itself. And then it's rested, labeled, bottled, shipped, and enjoyed. Carefully. So we're talking and spending all this time about bourbon because bourbon is a trending area in the market. Kentucky currently has 68 distilleries. That number is up 250% in the last 10 years. There are 32 counties with at least 2 distilleries in each of them. In Kentucky, there were 8 distilleries in 2009. There are an average of 2 barrels per person in the state or the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And in 2018, Kentucky ran 1.4 million tours. It's becoming Disney World. There's been the tour percentage has gone up 370% in 10 years. So when you said that Napa 12 years ago, they said go to Kentucky and go to the Bourbon Trail before it becomes Disney World,
Too late.
we've missed the boat on that one. Last year, the bourbon industry in the United States, or the bourbon industry saw $3.7 billion, and $2.7 billion of that came from here in the U.S. On our list, we stocked 41 bourbons, 27 whiskeys, and 23 ryes. That is a huge portion of our list as it's on. So in watching and learning, I took a couple things from a gentleman that runs the tours at Buffalo Trace. He is third generation at Buffalo Trace, and his words resonated with me. Some important things about bourbon is that you never bring out old, aged bourbon until you're with family and friends, and that you're in no rush to go anywhere. So that said, let's have some fun and let's build a contest out of this. So contest details. Contest is highest dollar sales starting tonight, running through September 22nd. Bourbons, whiskeys, and ryes are all eligible. And there will be a bartender contest. There will also be a server contest. For servers, you're required to attend 4 classes to be eligible to play. And I'll keep you updated with who's in the running, who's in a good place, and who has room to grow with this. The cool thing with this is that we've got stuff on the list at $200 a shot. So everyone has a shot at this, and everybody has room to play. For servers, if you're on a team, both of you will get those points for the night. For the bar, it will work the same way. If you're on a team behind the bar for the evening, main bar, upstairs bar, outside bar, everyone will get the total number of dollars sold applied to them for the night.
So you get a total of the 2 people together?
Yes. So if you and Sam are working together and you do 2 shots of Boss Hog at $200, you both get the 400 points for the both of you. 2 shots, $200, 400 total. Does that make sense?
Okay.
For the day, for the week. We have different vendors coming in the last 4 weeks of classes that will be bringing samplings, that will also be bringing prizes. I am in Kentucky for a week starting next week, and we'll pick up all sorts of swag and merch along the way for giveaways at the end. I will keep you updated weekly with how everybody is doing, and this will be a winner-take-all contest for the bartenders and for the servers. There'll be 2 separate contests running each category. I have this on Schedulefly. It's posted on the wall in the back, but I have dates for you for classes going further. We're going to do today, we're going to do next Monday, then we're going to take a break for a week, and then hit September 26th, the first 2 Tuesdays in September, taking one off for Memorial Day, Labor Day, excuse me, and then one off for September 9th, which is the all-team something. So all-team something. And then last class will be September 16th. We will run the contest through that Sunday, the 22nd.